Hello and welcome to another episode of Gender Stories. As ever, I am delighted and excited because I always have. I have the coolest guest. I can't help it. And today I'm so delighted to be here with Enfys J, who is an author, priestx, blogger, teacher, performer, singer, songwriter, and comedian. We only like guests to keep very busy, and all our guests always do. They wrote the Gold COVR award-winning Queer Qabala, Nonbinary, Genderfluid, Omnisexual Mysticism Magick, published by Llewellyn, and it's a wonderful book. If you haven't checked it out, please do. They've also co-authored with Ivo Dominguez Jr. Sagittarius Witch that came out this year, and wrote the forthcoming Queer Rites, a Magickal Grimoire to honor your milestones with pride, which will come out in early 2025, I believe, right? So excited about this book too. They're also a founding member of the funny, filthy, feminist fandom folk band, The Misbehaving Maidens, the creator of a website on queer magic called majorarquina.com, and the host of a podcast called For Quick Cues, Book Talk with Enfys, where they interview pagan authors using questions determined by a roll of the dice. They have taught many classes on tarot, hermetic Kabbalah, magical rites of passage, and queering one's magical practice at conferences and events around the world. By day, Enfys is a technical account manager at a tech company specializing in content migration and onboarding new customers. As a non-binary, bisexual, pagan, and performance, Enfys employs a queer lens to break down limiting binaries in magical practice and advocates for bi, trans, non-binary, genderqueer, queer, and asexual visibility and inclusion through their writing and music. Welcome, and happy Beltane, actually. It's Beltane on the day of our interview, which is great.
Yes, blessed Beltane to you. And I'm so excited to be here. As we talked about before we started recording, I'm such a fan of your work. I think that the how to understand your gender and how to understand your sexuality should be required reading for all humans. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to see what you think about how to understand your relationships. That's coming out in January.
Yes. Exciting.
I know we can do a book swap early next year.
That would be great. Yeah, ours are coming out the same month, so we could have we could do cross promotion.
That's true. We totally could. Oh, see, I love this kind of mutual admiration that goes on with all my guests, and I get to meet such good people. This is why I keep doing the podcast. Well, thank you for being on Gender Stories. I know we connected a little bit online, and maybe one day we'll get to meet in person at Paganicon or somewhere. But for today, I would love for you to just tell the listeners more about the upcoming book. I mean, the title alone, I am there. I'm like, Queer Rites, a Magickal Grimoire to honor your milestones with pride. I was like, yes, I want this book. Just tell me what is the book about? What inspired you to write it? Go for it.
I'm so excited for this book to get released. It is a book I wish I'd had many years ago, and it's one that I hope will help a lot of different people who are approaching milestones related to their queerness, their gender, their sexuality, and find ways to not only honor those milestones, but honor them in a magical way. So one thing that happened to me that sort of spurred the creation of this book is, like many trans and non-binary people, I decided to change my name during the COVID pandemic. In late 2020, I kind of hit that moment of, okay, I need a name that better matches my gender identity, that better matches who I am inside. And I ended up changing my first, middle, and last name all at once because it was time for all three. So going through that process and all of the bureaucratic steps that take forever was an interesting and sort of fraught and emotional process, but there was never one moment where I felt like my name is changed, or there was no step in that process that told my soul that this is my new name, right? So I knew I needed some kind of magical ritual to do that. And I reached out to one of the elders in my pagan tradition, which is the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, based in the Mid-Atlantic region. And my elder, Robin Fennelly, who's an amazing human and extremely smart, I said, I don't know where to begin. I'd been writing rituals for several years, but I had no idea where to start writing a name change ritual. There was no prior art I could use on this. And so I was like, what do I do? And she came through, she understood the assignment and over delivered, if anything. She came up with not only a completely written out ritual, start to finish, she gave me astrological timing that would work based on my birth chart and transits, and she created a sigil with my new name that I could use and empower in the ritual. And it was incredible. And I took what she wrote. I ended up making just a few changes based on what was really part of my spiritual practice at the time. I wanted to weave it in with that, but I largely kept it pretty much the same and did the ritual the day after my 41st birthday. And there happened to be like an eclipse. So there was like lots of really interesting and good astrological stuff going on, in addition to, you know, this is the anniversary of when I got the name. And the day after, I think, is sort of significant. Like, okay, we're honoring that, and then we're stepping forward with something new. So in the process of doing that, and in the ritual where I told my soul, all my parts of self, all of the spiritual beings that I work with, this is my new name. Absolutely, clearly, this is the moment when everything changes. I found so much benefit from doing that. Not only did it help me settle in better to my non-binary identity, but also I think it smoothed the path for actually changing that name. The best example I can give here is I found shortly after doing that ritual, I found an organization called Trans Maryland, where all they do is help trans people change their names. And the legal hoops are pretty intense. And I think if I had not found them, I would still be trying to change my name 4 years later, because there was just so much, especially with how government services changed in 2020. There were just a lot of gotchas that were not easy to find. And so they were a big help. My transition at work was super smooth. My coworkers took to the new name very quickly, and all the logistical stuff at work changed really easily. So it was really beneficial for me, not just from a logistical standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint. And I thought, I've had so many queer milestones in my life. You know, when I came out to myself as bisexual, when I came out to myself as non-binary, when I came out to others as bisexual and non-binary, those were about 10 years apart. And actually more like 20. But each of these milestones, I sort of did them, but there was no like, ta-da, you know, like there was no, this is a thing that, oops, I bumped my microphone. Hopefully that didn't cause a noise.
No.
There was no moment of like, this is real, you know? And I thought about how we treat rites of passage in our culture, and not just on a magical level, but on a mundane level. And I thought, boy, what are some of the biggest ones that we do celebrate? And how have those kind of gotten twisted in interesting ways? Like weddings are kind of a prime example. So over commercialized. Like capitalism has wrecked so much of like the concept of a wedding for so many people. Another example is when people get to an older age, what do? We have all these jokey over the hill kind of things. And like, there's almost a shame in with this rite of passage. And even, you know, graduations are a big thing, but there's so much pomp and circumstance meant to please so many people that it kind of loses the individual impact. So the more I thought about this, the more I'm like, where is the playbook for how to honor these things within ourselves? And especially as queer people who have to write our own scripts for so much of our lives, because we don't see ourselves in pop culture. Thankfully, that's getting better. But, you know, I grew up in the 90s, and the only bisexual person I remember seeing was the character on My So-Called Life, who didn't immediately resonate with me. But I was just like, there was no representation. So finding ways that we can honor those big events in our lives, whether it's taking your first dose of HRT, whether it's, you know, coming out, whether it's going to your first queer political action, all of these are kind of big deals. And how do we use magic to not only honor that moment and give it the reverence and impact that it deserves, but how can we also use magic to give us more courage to go through it? How can we use magic to solidify our chosen family, for example? Like there's things that magic can really help with in our queer lives. So the reason I wrote this book is I had seen many rituals sort of scattered through a bunch of books for a few different queer rites of passage, but I hadn't seen one book that's like, here you go. This is your queer grimoire. This is everything you need for all your rites of passage. And so that's what
I
I've put
think that
together.
is so great because rituals are so important, even outside of a pagan framework. As a therapist, I often talk to people about the importance of rituals, like even if it's everyday rituals, right? When I work with couples or polycules, okay, how, if you live together, how do you greet each other in the morning? How do you come back together? How do you manage those transitions, right? And I don't know if it's because I'm neurodivergent or because I was brought up Catholic and then became pagan, that I think that, and there's some good literature as well, why we need ritual as humans, but we need like those intentional moments, right? Because otherwise we just go through life, and that intentionality does bring like a sacredness with it, right? Especially, when we do kind of pagan ritual. And so when I saw that this was your next book, I was like, yes, we absolutely need this. This is a great idea. And I know it's something that people have really grappled with, right? I've worked with a lot of young people where maybe they and their family and their faith community decided to do some sort of naming ritual when they transitioned. And it has so many layers, right? It's not just for the young person, it's also for the family, the community, right? Because some ritual might be by ourselves, but some rituals might be with other people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and I think what
Mm-hmm.
I love about pagan rituals is that it's not about all this kind of things that capitalism puts on rites of passage and celebrations, but it's really like, what is our intention? What is our focus, right? How do we do this? And
Mm-hmm.
so that is so exciting. And like you said, there isn't anything like that because also, I don't know about you, but when I first came into paganism, God, how long ago is this? Over 25 years ago at this point. I feel so old sometimes, maybe close to 30 years at this point when I came into paganism. Gender was very binary. There wasn't a lot of queerness in pagan spaces, at least in my experience. First I
Mm-hmm.
started exploring paganism in the UK, and then I moved to the so-called US over here. But I think there are still not enough queer spaces, but definitely 25, 30 years ago, even less so. It was very much Lord and Lady in Wicca, very binary. I don't know if that was your experience too, and if that was part of kind of your desire to produce some of the work, the beautiful work you have done, both in terms of teaching and books.
Absolutely. It was part of my not only my spiritual journey, but my own gender journey as well, was having that moment of, I kind of came to I sort of came to paganism late. I had my first girlfriend in college introduce me to Wicca, and we did like a couple little ritual things sort of at our Catholic
Yep.
college, very, very naughty. But then I didn't really start to explore and practice deeply apart from those couple of Silver Ravenwolf books that I got early
We've all
on.
been there.
I didn't really start to get into it. Yep. Oh, we've all been there, and respect.
Sadly.
This was what we had, and it was great for the time. And I know Silver is still producing
Mhm.
some great stuff. But for me, I came into my tradition is a syncretic Wiccan tradition. And so I read a lot of stuff about Wicca. And as you say, there's a lot of Lord and Lady. There's a lot of like myth for
Yes.
fertility cycles in the mythology, and very much heteronormative coupling and all of that. And I sort of took it as rote at first, which is sort of weird considering, I was a women's studies minor. I am a queer person. I didn't quite know the non-binary thing at the time when I started exploring, but it sort of hit me one day. I was like, especially when we started learning about masculine and feminine energy, and this idea that I call it sort of the IKEA theory of magic. You have this masculine form of energy, which is very active and projective and positive, and this feminine energy, which is receptive and negative and passive. And insert tab A into slot B, you get magic, right? And the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, okay, I can see this is sort of
Mhm.
training wheels, right? This is the idea of, there's so many different kinds of energy that it's overwhelming. So if we limit to two that sort of interact in a very simple way, that makes sense. But why do we have to call them masculine and feminine energy? Why can't we just call it projective and receptive? Because when you look at how they are described, masculine as active and positive and projective and feminine as receptive and, all of that. It just sounds like gender roles
Yeah.
under patriarchy. And we're basically just perpetuating that in our traditions. So to me, it's like, let's just sand off the gender labels. We don't need them. You can still use these types of energy. I think they exist. But why do we call them that? And why do we reinforce patriarchy with our teachings? I think is a big issue because it's still happening. It's not like it went away 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's still a thing. And so one of the classes I teach is queering your magical practice. And I have people think about that. And they're like, are there only two types of energy? Even if you are dyed in the wool Wiccan, we still have things like the four elements. We still have the pentacle. Like there's all these multifaceted energy interactions that transcend this binary gender metaphor. So just reminding people that the power of the liminal, I think, is something a lot of us are familiar with as well, the things that are both and neither. So thinking about that and thinking about, if I'm calling to the divine masculine, the divine feminine, what about the divine both and neither? So that certainly exists. And to ignore it actually erases our history and our folklore, because we have so many gender fluid deities throughout pantheons and, ones who change and who, will disguise themselves as the other gender and, things like that. So it's so important to widen our lens. Like, I'm not trying to tell people the goddess doesn't exist. I certainly wouldn't do that. But widening our lens and seeing there's more than just masculine and feminine, I think is a really crucial message to get across to a lot of pagans.
And it's so reductive when we think about it in just this small way, right? It's reductive of nature. There's a lot of queer reproduction in nature, right? So it's also reductive of the magic that's inherent in the world, it feels like. And yeah, I remember I was not out as trans, not even to myself, when I first came into paganism, but I was queer. And somehow even I knew that, for example, Dianic traditions were not for me. There was just something that didn't work there, right? Even though I was reading a lot from some of the authors at the time and a lot of second wave feminist witches, right? And somehow that was just not resonating, right? That didn't feel like quite fitting with my experience. And over this last 2-3 decades, I've seen some attempts. Sometimes people are like, well, we have the Lord and Lady, but it doesn't matter which gender the people are. And I was like, that's great, but you're still, like you said, we're still reproducing the same messages. And we need to ask ourselves, where did some of those things came from? Because some of those things did come from like the 40s and the 50s, where gender roles were in a certain way. And when we take the much broader, not just white supremacists, not just colonial perspective, actually so much more, magic is so much more expansive, right? And mysterious ones are so much more expansive. But sometimes it upsets people. I remember saying to somebody, I was like, well, not all deities, even apart from the gender bending deities, right? Not all deities are have to be cis. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, well, if Freya is more what we would call a trans woman, that would make sense to me in terms of Amazons and like all of that. It was like, the way we think about gender doesn't have to be biological. But some pagans get pretty riled up when you say things like that. What's been your experience of like really queering pagan spaces when you teach or present? Like, do you get any pushback? Do you get any kind of, I don't know, discomfort from folks? Or yeah.
I find that I'm usually teaching a workshop that is one of many at a conference, and people tend to self-select for what messages they want to hear. So I have not had a ton of pushback, but I do want to be careful when I teach, especially I'm teaching at an event in Glastonbury this summer.
Yeah.
That's the Goddess Conference. And a lot of it is very goddess focused. And one thing I really respect about this event is they want to be extremely gender inclusive, and they made a point to invite lots of trans and non-binary speakers, including yours truly. So I love that they are pushing that, especially given the location. But I want to be very conscious of the fact that for a lot of people, finding goddess worship was
Oh,
revolutionary
absolutely.
for them, having been brought up in a
Hmm.
patriarchal religion with one masculine god. Finding something that better reflects who they are inside, or forces that they want to honor, even if they don't personally identify with them, they want to honor this other side of things. I want to respect that. And I don't want to be like, just throw it all out and it's all queer gods now and that's it. So I want to be careful because I want to respect where people are coming from, but I do want to gently pry open the viewpoint just a little bit where I can. And sometimes I do feel a little nervous because I will be speaking to my own
Hmm.
tradition where a lot of people are just like masculine, feminine, that's what it is. And I'm like, okay, but what about more? Like, how can we take it to the next level? And that's the framework I try to go from rather than like everything
Yeah.
we've done before is wrong. How do we take it to the next level? How do we
Hmm.
expand on that and make it more all encompassing? Because as you say, it's not only erasing a lot of our folklore and our deities, but also human existence. Like we have trans people, we have intersex people, we have all kinds of things that you want your magic to encompass kind of the totality of human existence,
Hmm.
human and animal and everything else. So, because queer people exist, queer magical things exist and should be honored and recognized.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. And I know, I mean, even for me, like, I was born in 71, like just kind of the divine feminine, I was brought up a second wave feminist, that when I have a degree, a PhD in women's studies, it was called women's studies at the time, and and I used to teach women's studies. And so it is really powerful. And I want to be respectful of legacy and at the same time knowing that there's so much more, right? Because I think it's easy to just kind of think back, I don't know, 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, right? Rather than this much bigger picture of how did we come to be under Christian supremacy? What does it mean to reclaim some of our traditions and some of our histories, depending of who our ancestors are, right? And it's such a both end work for me, if that makes sense, right? But there was something that I
Mm-hmm.
was grasping out in my mind around the limiting, that it doesn't just impact, I was thinking as you were talking, I don't think this only impacts trans and queer folks and intersex folks. I think it also impacts just cis people, even cis straight people. I think about how much importance, for example, we give sometimes to the womb, the womb as like generative of
Mm-hmm.
like life and creativity. And I've seen cis women go through a real identity crisis if they needed to have an hysterectomy, for example. What does it mean if I have an
Mm-hmm.
hysterectomy due to health issue? Does that make me less of a powerful witch? Does that make me less of a woman? Where does my power come from, right? When we attach to like an organ, like that's where life comes from,
Mm-hmm.
that's where magic comes from, creativity comes from. I think it can be really hurtful to everybody. That, I don't know, does
Mm-hmm.
that make sense? It just feels like, I don't know if you've had that experience
Absolutely.
of seeing just how, if we reduce things too small, how that impacts folks. Hmm.
Certainly. And back when I thought I was cis,
Yeah.
we all have those periods. Back when I thought I was cis, I never wanted to have children. I had no interest in bearing children naturally, in
Hmm.
adopting them, anything. And so when people are like, "Oh, the mighty power of the womb," I'm like, "No, like that's not where I feel my source of power is. That's not I did not opt into these factory specs and I do not wish to I would like to void the warranty and like you know, and yeet that out of
Hmm.
my system." But and so having people be like, well, to be truly a woman is to, and it's like, no, it's about so much more. And it's one of the things I loved was the book
Hmm.
Jailbreaking the Goddess that takes that sort of triplicate form that a lot of people love, Maiden, Mother, Crone. But like, how about if we don't tie it to
Yes.
reproductive cycles? and your ability to bear children, whether you've born children, whether you're too old to bear children, is kind of a, as you say, reductive way to look at the life cycle of a cis woman. There's so much more. So taking that into this fivefold model that Lazara Fox Allen does, where it's different phase, you could be any of them in any phase of life, I think was really important work, and the type of thing we really need to continue doing and paying attention to is, while a lot of people do feel tremendous power from their fertility and their ability to create children, and I want to respect that, it is not everybody's experience. And so when, as you say, we tie our magic specifically to that one aspect that is just one part of being a human, it really makes it harder for other people to find themselves in the magic, whether they're cis, trans,
Exactly.
or otherwise.
And even, which is so interesting because I was a gestational parent for my oldest child, and it's, for me, I was like, oh, my body's finally doing exactly what it was meant to do. I had the least gender dysphoria when I was pregnant, which I know is not true for other trans masculine people, right? But there was something about that experience that worked for me, but not in that paradigm of like motherhood, that didn't quite fit. But like yes, gestation is its own experience, just like aging, it's its own experience, just like transitioning, it's its own experience, right? We're such multifaceted human. And I love what you said about also the power of the liminal. I've in that, I think that when we put things into like tidy boxes or binaries, then we lose a bit of that power of the liminal, maybe. And I would love for you to talk more about that power. I think that one thing that queerness brings to magic is the liminality, right? That power of the liminal. But I would love to hear like your thoughts about liminality and magic and gender and queerness, if you want to.
Of course. Yeah. It reminds me of one of my favorite slides I've ever created for a workshop is explaining to people many of the different labels of queerness, the different types of queerness, genderqueer, genderfluid, all of these different like sort of non-binary labels. And then the next slide is just a friendly reminder to folks that you don't get to determine anyone else's identity. People get to pick their own labels because, as any cat will tell you, having someone else put you in a box is an entirely different experience from you getting into a box yourself. So, just reminding people, like, remember, be a cat, remember what it's like to be a cat, and don't put other people in boxes they don't want to be in. So, yeah, the power of the liminal is so profound, and it's something I continue to explore because we're coming out of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, and Pisces loves like black and white, this or that, this box or this box. There is no in between. And the age of Aquarius is much more, hey, what if it's, a lot more fluid than that? And I'm really excited we're coming into that era because there's so much more opportunity for expansive thought in that. So within my magic, I try to be open to all sorts of different energies and spirits. And one of the things with my first book, Queer Qabala, that I found particularly profound, just in a simple look at the structure of the tree of life, is that you have what some people call the masculine pillar and what some call the feminine pillar, but then you have one in between that's the pillar of balance. And in that pillar of balance, it takes the energies from the other two pillars and transmutes them into something new and something different and something more powerful. So this idea that, yes, perhaps we do have these binaries, but then there's this thing that's both and neither, that gets us from the ultimate perfect unity of the universe down to the chaos of manifestation and all of the things, this infinite manifestation that we live in of all different genders and sexualities and people of all different types. And the fact that those experiences are both on this middle pillar. They're not considered masculine experiences or feminine experiences. They are considered this both and neither. And I think that's what creation is. It's everything, and it's both profound, intense unity, but also infinite, compelling, wonderful diversity. And for me, that's an incredibly profound magical concept.
I love that. I really want to stay with that a moment because I think that is part of what I really love about your work is that expansiveness, right? That expansiveness does feel there's something sacred in that expansiveness, right? There's something very like secret and connecting about that expansiveness. Whereas, what I find that whenever I come across traditions where things are like, it's this and this, right? Very binary, this Lord and Lady. Everybody just feels a little more scrunched up, regardless of their gender identity, right? There's just more constriction. And so
Mm-hmm.
I love, why try to constrict magic when magic can be just as expansive as life, right? I mean, it is life, right? It is that spark of creation,
Mm-hmm.
that spark of life. And that is so expansive and in a way its own mystery, right? Of both and neither, like you said, and
Yes.
presence and absence at the same time and all of that.
I think expansiveness is our word for the podcast. I think between us, we've probably said it about 20, 30 times now, which I'm totally fine
That's
with.
probably true.
But, and it's a challenge that I offer to people who are in positions of power within various pagan traditions is to consider, are you really being inclusive, or are you just sort of painting a label on something? Like, I know within the OTO, there was a whole situation with like, oh yeah, non-binary people can be priests. They just have to decide if they're going to be the masculine or the
Exactly.
feminine in ritual. And it's like, that's not the
No.
same as being inclusive. That is forcing people to make a choice, or like, well, we always stand boy, girl in circle, so just decide which one you're going to be. And it's like, hey, that's what it's the antithesis of being non-binary, being asked to choose. It's like, no, we've made a choice that is neither, thank you, or neither or both. Uh, so I think that's something that there are folks, particularly who are maybe from older generations, who are trying to catch up and want to be inclusive and want to bring in new people, but they're not asking those people how they could feel included. And they're just sort of making assumptions about what works. And then they're surprised when they don't get new members who are more gender expansive. They're like, but we put the label on the thing, like, it's not the same. We need to be not just allies, but co-creators of spaces that are welcoming and inclusive and affirming and empowering to people of all different genders and sexualities. If you just say, oh, you're welcome to our picnic, but you better do things exactly the way they've been done for the last 50, 60 years. And by the way, just sort of overlook the fact that they make you feel alienated. That's not welcoming
No,
you to
that's
the
just trying
picnic.
to assimilate people in, it's like that. And I see that in so many traditions around, I mean, even in my own reclaiming tradition and some of the work of like wanting to be more welcoming to like folks of color, but then not wanting to do things differently. And I'm like, well, this is not how it's going to work. Like if you have new people into the circle are going to bring change. That's just how humans work, right? If our circle broadens, then our circle is going to change. And that's part of the beauty of creation and relationship and interdependence. And yeah, I'm with you. I see so much of like, you were like, I remember people going, you're totally welcome to this moon circle. And I was like, and are trans women welcome if it's a women only space? And why am I welcome, right? Because I'm a womb, and I'm like, that is not, that doesn't make me feel welcome. Actually, it makes me feel really erased and unseen and not okay, And I remember having these conversations over and over, and often with people my age or even younger than I am, not just with people older than me. And I think that that's the thing. So many queer folks have been present in paganism, but being like either pushed out of tradition or at the edges of tradition. Because I know folks in their like 60s and 70s who are like, we would say genderqueer or trans or non-binary. Obviously, I mean, the non-binary language wasn't even there when I first came out. I think I went from genderqueer to trans masculine, to non-binary, like what is even language, right? But I think that there's always been this current, but it's been like pushed aside, and now there's just it's almost like a number game. There's just such a presence, even the last witch camp I was at, there were so many trans, non-binary, and queer younger witches. I was like, oh, hang on, my tradition, because I'd taken a little break during the pandemic, the tradition is changing, that there's many more of us who don't fit necessarily into certain boxes. And that does change things. Because, if there's one or two of you, it's different than if there are 10, 20, 30 of you, right, in a circle. So.
Right. The COVID cocoon was really profound for a lot of us, myself included. When you take us away from our social spaces for long enough and we have to examine who am I apart from what people expect me to be, suddenly things happen. But one thing, I'm very fortunate within my tradition, because while our charter, when I, came out as non-binary and then at the same time was looking to become one of the leaders of our tradition to run my coven, I was like, look, I'm non-binary, and it says every coven has to have a high priest and a high priestess. And we currently had a high priestess in my coven who is, a cis woman. And I said, if the only thing preventing me from filling the leadership void when our high priest left is a penis, that's stupid. And, I'm non-binary. I feel like I should be able to step. Is this charter saying I can't be a leader because I don't identify as a priest or a priestess? And ultimately, we got the tradition to change the charter, and it was kind of a no-brainer for the tradition. They're like, yeah, obviously we should do this. And now it says 2 leaders for every coven and leaves it at that. So, the main reason it was in there, I believe, was so that nobody tried to form a single gender coven, because they wanted to make sure that there is welcome diversity in all of our covens, gender and otherwise. So I'm glad that we have that consciousness, but also now the rules that say basically anyone can be a leader. And I'm not the only one who's done that too. We now have other covens with 2 cis women leading them, where before there was no way for someone who is a cis woman to step up in a coven that already had a high priestess. So it's been good for cis people as well. Not really limiting who is able to be leadership based on who's already there.
Especially when we think about gender and leadership, and especially like in pagan spaces where it tends to be more traditionally, I think, femme folks than like cis men, for example, in my experience. And so then you get cis men coming in going like straight into leadership, straight into teaching, straight into, we need to have a man on the team. Otherwise, right? And it's just like, oh, this is like the, mundane world all over again. I've been in a lot of like, female majority professions, but male dominated leadership, right? Education, healthcare. I was like, oh, magic, non-profits, right? Magic, no difference. It's like the penis is like this highway into leadership. And I'm like, is this really necessary? I know that would make a good t-shirt, wouldn't it?
I was just thinking that's a great slogan.
But you know what I mean? And I was like, do we really need to do that in pagan circles? Especially because it's like, on one hand, it is very goddess centered still in a lot of ways, which is powerful in a Christian supremacist kind of overculture. But then it's, again, this patriarchy and this pipeline to leadership was really favored men in a lot of traditions, in my experience.
Yeah, same here. And that was something that I was noticing as well within my tradition. And it puts a lot of pressure on men too. Like, it's not necessarily a good thing for them either, because there's kind of pressure like, well, we don't have a high priest. We've only got one dude in the coven. Guess what? You're going to be a leader, even if they're super not ready for that. So it wasn't necessarily good for anybody.
Oh, well, whether you like it or not, you have to, fit into this role. Absolutely. So... yeah, I have so many thoughts about that. Anyway, I was like, we could talk for quite a while,
you and I think.
I was like, I digress. But I know one of the things I was kind of looking at, like my little notes, because I usually make myself just some very loose notes of like things I could talk about with this guest. Um, Really, this kind of, we've talked a little bit about it, but I'm just really curious about what, to kind of go back to the beginning, what were the rights when you were writing the book that's coming out in early in 2025?
Mhm.
What were the rights that maybe you didn't immediately think about, but as you were writing the book, you were like, oh, yeah, this rights linked to queerness or linked to gender, even that maybe were a little bit more unexpected or not quite what was right there on the surface, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I turned in my initial draft of the book and my editor came back saying, "This is great. Give us a few more rituals." And I was like, "I have already encapsulated all of queer experience." Like I hadn't, but I was like, "I'm out of ideas. What do I do?" And I sort of pulled aside a couple of my queer friends like, "Help." And they had some good ideas, thankfully. And my friend Reverend Ron Padron said, "What about going to your first queer political action?" And I was like, "Oh, that is a good one," because for a lot of people, they don't actually get involved in politics until they realize how very personal those politics are. So for a lot of people, coming out may be pretty closely tied to their first political action, whether it's specifically a queer one or not. And that is a scary thing. And in a previous job, I actually helped train people to become grassroots advocates and how to call your members of Congress and why it's not as scary as it sounds and all of that kind of thing. Pro tip for anyone listening, if you have resisted doing this, A, you can call after hours and leave a voicemail and not talk to a human if you want. It has the same impact. B, the person answering the phone is an intern and they have no interest or time in debating you. So do not be afraid. Call, do the thing. It makes a bigger impact than emailing. Anyway, that's the short version of everything I did for 2 years. But but anyway, I thought, yeah, that's a scary thing for people. People are scared to get involved politically. And, especially with how literally dangerous certain protests are and things. What do people need? It's a rite of passage, but it also can be a very scary thing. So, calling up the courage of our queer ancestors and our queer advocate ancestors. And in that ritual, I actually challenged people to find a local queer ancestor who was politically active, if they can, someone from their region who they can call into their spirit and say, "Hey, will you walk with me today as I do this scary thing?" So that was one that wasn't immediately obvious, but I think it would be helpful. Another one, I kind of resisted doing ones related to romantic relationships because I thought it's not a uniquely queer thing to have a romantic relationship. But then the more I thought about it, the more like, if you've gone through your life assuming you are straight or cis, your first time entering a relationship where at least one of you is queer can be kind of a new thing, especially if you've come to a recent understanding of yourself that's different from what it has been. There can be a tendency to sort of slide back into previous patterns of maybe things that didn't work for you in the past. And of course, we can do this with all relationships, right? But like, if you have just come out as a trans man and you are getting into a relationship, maybe with a cisgender person, maybe with another trans person, but maybe you feel compelled to act a certain way based on history and what you have done. So, how can you have a rite of passage that helps you step into that relationship as your authentic self and not compromise that? And the more I thought about that, I'm like, okay, yeah, this wasn't something I originally wanted to write about, but now I think it is actually really important. Your first queer relationship is kind of a big deal. And how do you make sure that you don't either devolve into stereotype or just like, especially if you are with someone who is not queer, I think there's also a concern about erasing yourself, or if you're with someone who's queer but not out, there's some interesting dynamics there. So those were two of the new ones that I wrote. I'm trying to think of what the third one was because I came up with 3 new ones to add and it's just escaped my brain. But yeah, those were a couple that weren't immediately like, yes, of course we need a ritual for this. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, no, we do. We do need rituals for
Yeah, and I
these
think with
things.
queer relationships in particular, rituals can be so important because We know the relationships have a higher chance of ending if there isn't support, for example, from people around you, right, from the community. And that
Mm-hmm.
is one of the challenges that queer relationships face. Or I remember, one of my friends talking about how scary it was to hold the hand of somebody of the same gender for the first time, which was also cultural, right? Because for me, I was like, oh, culturally, I've done a lot of holding hands with my like friends of the same gender growing up, but not everybody does. I was in a historical and cultural moment where that wasn't seen as queer, whereas my peers in other geographical
Right.
spaces like the UK and the US of my generation had experienced that being seen as queer and inappropriate, right? And so all these things that we don't think about, or like the first time I went to Pride, I still remember my first big London Pride,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like just that coming into this like sea of people, and how powerful that can be. Absolutely. Those moments are rites of passage. They do, it's like who you were before and who you were after that moment is different in some way. You are changed and transformed, and that is magic, right?
Yeah. And you
Oh,
just reminded
great.
me what the third one is. It's a ritual for going into your first queer
Oh,
community event or
yes.
space. As like, because yeah, it can be scary. It can be so scary. And you don't just do rite of passage rituals because you're afraid, but they do have the ability to help bolster you and help you step bravely into a new phase of your life and all the different things that that
Absolutely. I
means.
find that magic is like so grounding and strengthening for me that when I get caught up in the grind of the day to day, and if my practice goes on the wayside, that really impacts, right? Just my ability and capacity to engage with the world, right? Just there's something about my spiritual practice that really expands my capacity to be present with myself, with my work, with my family. And it's just, I don't know if it's that intentionality, if it is that connection to something greater than we are as individuals, but it does give us strength, which we might need. Like I remember, yeah, just standing on the other side of the street to the gay pub, like Saturday night after Saturday night, not being able to go in, right? Or like calling the helpline because the
Mm-hmm.
internet wasn't quite as what it is now. Or, then finally going into my first like queer coffee shop, which, or the first time I went into a queer feminist sex store, all of those moments are pretty pivotal and important in people's lives. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, the first time you take on
Yes.
new pronouns and having the courage to tell people about it, having the courage to correct people after you've told them about it and they mess it up. Um, there's a lot, and just the trying to get past the imposter syndrome of it. Especially, I grew up in Minnesota, and there is a cultural thing there with like not wanting to be a bother to people, not wanting to make anyone make an effort for you. You got to be easy, super easy to deal with, and you don't want to make waves. But so having to overcome that because there's, oh, I don't deserve to be respected in this way because it's hard for people to respect me in this way. Coming to the point where you're like, no, I deserve to be respected in this way. And even if it's a bother, even if it's hard for somebody, I'm going to keep asking them or demanding that they respect me in this way because I would do the same for
Absolutely. I
them.
am deeply familiar, having lived in Minnesota for the past 16 years. Yeah, it'll be 16 years this summer. With
Oh,
the
wow.
Midwest Minnesotan culture of like not being a bother, not being a burden, not wanting to eat the last thing left on a plate. I'm like, oh,
No one
exactly.
ever eats the last cookie ever.
Exactly.
Maybe that's how we got the whole thing about leaving an offering for like the ancestors or the spirits is no one would eat the last
Is
one, so
that
you
why
have
there are
to put
so
it
many
somewhere.
pagans here in Minnesota? Because it's like
Here's the thing that kills me. It just this isn't necessarily on topic, but I lived in Minnesota from age 2 to 25. So I spent 23 years of my life there. And I started to dabble in paganism in college. As I said, I went to college in St. Paul. I had no idea
Yes.
how big the pagan community was until I had been gone for 10 years. I lived in Maryland, and people were like, I still live in Maryland. I've been here since 2005. So almost 20 years at this point. And people are like, oh, you're from Minnesota. You must have been so active in the pagan culture. I'm like, what pagan culture? I had no clue. None. I knew 2 pagans total in my whole life that I was aware of, and just no idea. And then I found out that, like, my dad had gone to
Mm-hmm.
classes like when I was a teenager, like up in Minneapolis on various esoteric topics. And I'm like, could you have told me about these? I would have liked to have gone to those when I got older, you know? So yeah, it's one of those fascinating things I never knew. And coming to Paganicon and seeing how
Mm-hmm.
many people are there, I'm like, are you kidding me? Where were all of you my whole life? I would have loved to known all of you, especially with how many queer
It is a
folks there
very
are there.
quiet culture, I have to say, in some ways, right? There is this like, and I don't think it's an accident. There is like a huge pagan community, a huge queer and trans community, and also like a a big nerdy community, a big polyamorous community. I think that
Yes.
underneath the surface, but you kind of have to look for it. I remember when I first moved here, I was like, oh, where's
Mhm.
kink community? And people were like, there isn't one. And I'm like, okay, give me 5 minutes. I was like, there's definitely
Yep,
one. It's
seriously.
just a little bit more underground than say like the West Coast, for example. But it's there and it's actually pretty
Yeah.
large. All of those scenes are pretty big here in Minnesota, which is not what people think sometimes when they think about the state.
Yeah, and since I left, y'all got
Oh
burlesque
my
and
god.
roller derby. Like, where was that when I was like, that would have been so cool to
I
get
know.
involved in? But, it's okay. Like, I guess places I left are allowed to evolve and change and get better, I suppose. But,
That's okay. I always
but
joke that I'm
yeah.
like, I feel like I was born like 30 years too early. Now there would be all these cool things that I totally wanted to do as a kid or as a young person. But it's like, it's so interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and circling back to the Queer Rites of Passage book, like I said, I want this to be the manual that I,
Mhm.
I want it to sort of be a gift to my past self to not only be able to look through this and see, oh, these are things people can do, uh, but also just so, like, yes, going through this is a big deal, even if our culture doesn't necessarily tell you that. And it's okay to make a big deal of it and honor your emotions around it because they can be pretty intense. So I'm really hopeful that this book is found by a lot of younger folks. I'm hoping it's found by people of all
Mhm.
ages, of course, but like as someone's really starting, whatever their age, their gender journey, their sexuality journey, I'm hoping they can find this book and be like, oh, and feel better because rites of passage are
Yes.
anchors to the
Mhm.
self, I think. They tell us where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And I feel like it's one thing we really lack culturally right now is those anchors to the self and who am I, where I've been, and where I'm going. We sort of have this weird miasma right now of we're still in
Mhm.
2016. Like so many of us, we're still in 2016 and 2020. Time is a flat circle. And we now more than ever, we need to have those moments where you put a line in the sand and say, this is where I am. This is who I
Absolutely.
am.
And what I love is that they are an anchor to self and they can also be an anchor to community. If we have like a circle of people that we want to invite
Yes.
into some of those rites of passage, then it's also an anchor to each other. And I think we need that relational piece more than ever. Remembering how to be a community, how to be in relationship with each other, how to support one another, right? How to really see ourselves through the end of empire and late stage capitalism, and everything that we're going through right now.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful for, of course, we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? The people who wrote the first queer magical books that I read, Misha
Yes.
Magdalene, Cassandra Snow, like there's been such amazing work. Ariana Serpentine more recently, who also wrote the foreword
Mhm.
for Queer Rites, which I'm really excited about. I was like, I really want to make sure I have as many trans voices involved in this as possible. Um, so I think we're at a wonderful time, as you say. It's like, oh, was I born way too early? Because there's this explosion of queer magic
Yes.
books and information and circles and groups, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful, and I'm so thankful that I got to a point in my journey where I could write a book and release it at a time when that book was desired, by the publisher, and not like, oh, just, oh, you perverts, get out of here. It's like, no, this is a community we need to reach. These are people who we want to have as customers buying our books. I mean, it's an incredible time to be alive in a lot of ways, and a terrifying time for many other reasons, but I compare it to what I grew up with.
Oh,
And how different it
absolutely.
was.
Like even when I went through my initiation, that finding information about queerness and magic, you really had to look at like history. I remember reading Blossom of Bone, to understand like how, oh yeah, they've always been like queer people, right? But it was a much more like historical perspective rather than here's like queer magic, queer spirit, right? And of course, really honoring the work those like radical fairies have done, for better or worse, and all the challenges around trans inclusivity, but still, right? And it doesn't surprise me that there have always been a lot of queer and trans folks in paganism, because often we were the spirit workers, the healers, the edge walkers, right, in a lot of traditions and cultures. And so it's almost like as we're going through this moment of really challenging, white supremacy and colonialism, it makes sense to me that there is also this explosion of queer spirit, which is beautiful.
Yeah, and paganism tends to draw people from the margins in one way or another. Like this isn't the place to go if you're afraid of seeming weird, like or if you are, you're going to get over it fairly quickly, I think, because, there's always that moment early in your practice when you're like, I feel very silly right now. I am standing in front of my end table holding a stick and saying a chant, and I haven't quite gotten to the mental place of, no, this is an altar and a wand and a sacred thing. We all have those moments of just, yep, I am being very weird right now, and you kind of have to be okay with that at a point. And so those of us on the fringes are kind of used to being outcasts and behaving in ways that people would not expect or desire. And so, yeah, a lot of us come to paganism, which is part of why we need to be really make good efforts to be inclusive of people of all different backgrounds, sexualities, genders, races, ethnicities, like everything. We really need to meet people where they're at and help them blossom into the best version of them they can be, not the best version of what we think they should be.
That's beautiful. I feel like I could talk with you for like another 3 hours, but I want to be respectful of your time and of the
At
listeners
least.
who might not want the 3 hour episode, but maybe we'll just have to do another episode. I love repeat guests, so just do with that what you will.
I would love that.
One question I always ask before we end an episode is, was there anything else that we haven't talked about that you were hoping we would touch on? I always like to, and if there isn't, that's okay, but I always like to ask that question.
I think we had a wonderful conversation. The one like little question I had in my mind for you actually is, I'm wondering about your relationship with labels within the queer community as another person who is non-binary, because I have sort of this paradoxical relationship, and I'm curious if you are similar, like labeling yourself genderqueer versus non-binary versus
that's
whatnot.
a great question. I find that I love language. My first degree is in linguistics, and I've always looked at language as this like ever evolving, interesting thing that we do between people, right? Communication seems so simple, but actually it's not that simple. And so in terms of labels, I feel like I've embraced so many different labels over the lifespan for myself, and I'm not super attached, in a way. When the non-binary label came out, I was like, oh yeah, that is a better description, right? But I do also feel like, and not every non-binary person feels that way, but I also do feel trans and gender. Actually, I'm not an androgynous person, right? Like I have queer masculinity, but that's different than androgyny, right? And so I think that language is so interesting and it's so relational, right? Because it's like in some communities, I would probably describe myself as a trans faggot, in a reclaimed kind of way, but that is not something that I would necessarily put like in my public facing world, because it's not the most accessible of language for a lot of people. So for me, it's also like, what am I trying to communicate to the world, right? So when I say I'm transmasculine, I'm binary, I'm trying to communicate that yes, I'm transmasculine, but I'm not a trans man. It's a little more complicated than that, right? Like, or when other labels, like I have a lot of fondness and attachment to the label of bisexual, because I feel like I owe so much to bi community, for how they helped me when I went through my own identity crisis of like, oh, I guess I'm not a dyke. Oh, hang on a minute. I guess I'm also not a woman. This is getting complicated. And I feel like bi community could really hold that complexity in a way that I hadn't found in other parts of queer communities. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I have a very like fluid and relational, I guess, relationship with language and labels. And I'm like, oh, maybe in 20 years I'll call myself something else, because better language. I have one of my friends is like, I hate non-binary. It's just, why do we have to, it's like negating, right? What we defining ourselves according to the binary. I'm like, I can see that. But it's also very comprehensible in the outside world at the moment, rather than just having to go like, well, I have a queer masculinity and I'm trans, and that's a lot of words compared to like non-binary, right? I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, what about you? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel you. I think it's been so interesting to see the proliferation of labels and identities and helping us better understand the nuances of our gender and sexuality, and not only understand them, but also connect to people who use the same label and find, oh, you're like me, you get it. But on the other hand, there's this thing with labels to
Yes.
box people in and to be limiting. So it's a real gift to have that fluid relationship with them, but the outside world doesn't
Yeah.
really jibe with that most of the time. Like, but wait, I thought you said you were this, now you're this, you know? And it's like, well, I didn't tell you I was xenogender because you wouldn't know what that meant, and it would be a longer conversation than I felt like having at the time, So I just say non-binary because that's a word a lot of people know. So, but it's that thing of like trying to find the right one, and then sometimes the right one goes out of style. Like the conversation about bi versus pansexuality. Sometimes I will often say I'm bisexual. Sometimes I say I'm bi/pan. It's kind of a circular conversation that I'm like, I'm not really sure where I want to put myself here. It's like everyone is hot and I am scared. That's my sexuality. I like all the different flavors, but yeah, it's this interesting thing where there's pressure to choose an exact label that may or may not fit you in 5 or 10 years time. And if it doesn't fit you, does that negate that label later? It's one of those sort of complicated, largely non-binary things that I'm curious what other non-binary people think. So thank
Oh,
you for
anytime.
indulging
I
me.
love talking about language. And oh my God, the whole bi versus pan thing. I'm just like, it's okay. Like, they're kind of adjacent, but also different. I'm like, I am not like, and I'm like, gender plays a role in my attraction. Like, I'm mostly attracted to like masculinity, regardless of gender identity, which is also an interesting thing, and also like,
Yeah.
and queer genders, right? But there isn't a way of saying that, right? It's like I'm attracted to queerness mostly, and kind of a queer masculinity or something that queers, like, or very masculine, like femmes, for example, right? And just something that queers the expectation of gender. And so for me, bi fits better than pan, because I've had people like, why don't you call yourself pansexual? I was like, because I'm not. Like, I feel like the definition of pansexual is like, regardless of gender. And I'm like, but gender plays a factor in my attraction, which is not better or worse, it's just different. And maybe it's where my neurodivergence is
Yeah.
like the specificity of it, right? which is a thing in our house.
Right.
If we all get specific, it can be a very interesting moment. There's a lot of neurodivergence, but I'm like, well, that's not accurate. So, yeah.
No, I hear you. I think I put a glossary in the Queer Rites book, and I define bisexuality and pansexuality. And I say shares heavy overlap with the other, and the nuances may be different depending on who you talk to. Is kind of where I left it. I'm like, I'm sort of stepping out of this one.
And what's fascinating is that there was no bi versus pan that I was aware of like 25 years ago. And now it has become more of a thing. And it's been also really interesting for people to be like, well, bisexuality is like excludes trans people. I was like, not any more than any of the other sexuality labels. What? Like, no, that is not my experience. So it's also interesting how in the desire to be inclusive, we can become actually make up things that don't need to be there, if that makes sense. I was like, there's so much history of bi and trans movements, like collaborating and finding each other, and trans people in bi community and bi people in trans community. I was like, the overlap is huge. What are you all like? You know what I mean? It's like when this whole discourse exploded, I was like, what is even happening? Where did this come from? But yeah, so language and humans. Yes, it's fast and yes, so fascinating.
Yes. Yeah, I was an English major too, so I also share your love of language, both as a former English major and also a neurodivergent person, and always craving that specificity.
It's beautiful when you get it, when it's just the right word for the right experience. It's amazing. So satisfying.
Love it.
Oh, well, This has been wonderful. And I know I'll put all the links in the episode description. But if people wanted to find you and your wonderful work, where should they look for you?
Easiest place is my website, which is majorarqueerna.com. That's MAJORARQUEERNA.com. I'm at majorarqueerna on Instagram and Facebook. I am no longer on the network formerly known as Twitter, so if you see someone pretending to be me, that's not me. But if you want to follow my personal stuff and see my cats and whatnot, you can find me at Enfys Book on Instagram and at enfysbook at kind.social on Mastodon.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for making the time to be on Gender Stories today. I so enjoyed this conversation. And dear listeners, I hope you enjoyed this conversation about paganism and queerness and magic, which I don't think we've had quite this in this way before. So thank you, Enfys, for coming on Gender Stories, and maybe to the next episode that we'll do together.
That'd be wonderful. It's been an honor, Alex. Thank you so much.
Dear listeners, until next time, I hope you find your own way to feel expansive and your own rites of passage for whatever you want to mark in your own life.